Well, I can start while we're waiting for the slides to show up. So I brought some friends. I brought St. Augustine. I brought Weber, because I never go anywhere without my Weber. I brought Parker Palmer, and I brought Martin Heidegger, as I mentioned, and I'll sort of bring them in as appropriate here, because I was a little unclear as to how to do this, right? This is not a normal kind of activity for an academic. This is not a lecture. That's not kind of what this is supposed to do. So I wasn't quite sure how to approach the talk. So I knew I did two things I didn't want to do. Right? I didn't want to try to make an argument for an answer to the question, what matters to me and why, an argument that would try to persuade you that you should also care about those things. So I didn't want to do that. And I didn't want to just stand up here and deliver a creed. These are the things I believe. That if I do that, there's no conversation, because then it's just, I just said stuff, okay, that's the end of the story right there. So that doesn't really invite a conversation in. And if I tried to argue that you should believe the sort of things that I believe, well, that would already presume that we had a certain commonality from which we could have that argument, and I don't want to presume that. So not going to do it. So what am I going to do instead? What I want to do instead is I want to tell you a story. So I want to tell you an autobiographical story in particular. And there's something really weird about autobiographical stories, which I think I first noticed. I think it first became really clear to me when I was teaching Augustine when I was up at Columbia. And you teach. Actually, it wasn't the class I was in. We didn't teach Confessions. We actually taught Augustine's City of God, but it has the same basic format, where what Augustine is always trying to do in his work is he's trying to point out that after you've had certain kinds of experiences, then the past looks different. So things happen to you, and then you sort of remember them differently, because then things that weren't significant at the time suddenly turn out to be really significant, because then now you can see sort of what the fullness of a particular pattern is like. So after Augustine goes and has his conversion experience, then Augustine has these marvelously poetic passages at the end of the book, right? So then this is after Augustine has sort of been, he's been a pagan and atheist, and then he becomes Christian, and then he does a whole lot of celebration of this. But then he looks back over things and he says, "Late have I loved you, beauty so old and so new. Late have I loved you. And see, you were within, and I was in the external world and sought you there, and in my unlovely state I plunged into those lovely created things with you made. You were with me, but I was not with you. The lovely things kept me far from you, though if they did not have their existence in you, they had no existence at all. You called and cried out loud and shattered my deafness. You were radiant and resplendent, put flight to my blindness. You were fragrant, and I drew in my breath, and now pant after you." It's very clear that Augustine didn't think that at the time. Augustine only thought that afterwards, right? He then goes back and sort of recollects it, and oh, right, that must have been the hidden order of things. I say that by way of caution. Any autobiographical story is going to be told from the perspective of the present and how things now look in terms of the sorts of things that were significant in coming to matter for me. So bear that in mind as we go through the story. Now, in order to talk about the story, this is actually where I do need a picture. Things that looked really insignificant at the time or didn't really seem particularly important turn out in retrospect to be really, really important. And they only become important once you've got to the end of it, right? As T.S. Eliot talks about the whole thing of, we had the experience but missed the meaning. An approach to the meaning restores the experience in a different form. So it's the same basic idea that there's something really creative about memory. Are we getting there? Cool. So, all right. So I'm going to tell you a little autobiographical story. And in order to tell you an autobiographical story about sort of what matters to me, if you want to try to get a sense of what sort of things matter to me now, I want to take a theoretical principle from the main character of the Christian scriptures, this gentleman by the name of Jesus, who once argued, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Which I take as a theoretical principle to suggest that if you want to find out what's important to somebody, you kind of have to watch what they do, what they surround themselves with, what kinds of things in practice, in their behavior, actually come out, right? Asking somebody what's important to them is not necessarily going to get you an honest answer. But watching what they do, watching where their commitments actually are, watching what kinds of sacrifices they make, that's where you really start to see these things. Now, so if you were to walk into my office, which sometimes people do, you would discover some fairly interesting things. There are there's some walls, there's some posters up on my, my wall by my computer. I'm not going to talk about the sorting hat and the bobbleheads for a second, but if you just look at the posters, sort of what I want to call attention to, you would discover, there's a lot of other sort of Star Wars-y artifacts floating around in the office, that if you want to look at sort of where, where the treasure is, a lot of things in the office seem to refer to what I would argue now is sort of one consistent story, which is a story about not trying too hard to control the flow of events, because where you think you're setting out doesn't always turn out that way. So Mickey over here in Fantasia thinks he knows exactly what he's doing, and if you've seen The Sorcerer's Apprentice, you know how well that goes. And of course, Star Wars. Well, goodness gracious, the cute little blonde kid grows up to be Darth Vader. So, too much control is a problem, and so there's sort of cautionary notes about not being so kind of, not trying to be quite so focused on that sort of control of one's life. You see, what I started out to do when I was very young is I set out to be someone who knew a lot of stuff. Right? That was kind of my initial inclination. I had a lot of obscure facts at my disposal. I beat everybody except my mother in Trivial Pursuit. That was, that was one of my claims to fame. I was always the teacher's favorite student in every class I ever took. Right? I was that kid. What did they call us? They called us gifted and talented. Right? So it was that group. That was the kind of student that I was. And so what I knew that what I wanted to do when I grew up was I wanted to have some sort of job where you could know a lot of stuff and talk about it with people. And before Neil deGrasse Tyson was Neil deGrasse Tyson, there was, and the older people in the audience will recognize this gentleman, my man Carl Sagan, who, Neil deGrasse Tyson just did this recent Cosmos series, and of course that was a remake, and there was an original, and Carl Sagan did the original. Sagan was an astronomer and someone who was very interested in among other things, in questions of extraterrestrial life, but from a really sort of serious astrophysical scientific perspective, and did a series for PBS called Cosmos, and it was the very first series I was ever allowed to stay up past my bedtime to watch, because it was on late. But I got to stay up and watch Cosmos. It was hugely important. I was like, you know what, when I grow up, I want to be that guy. I want to know stuff, and I want to walk around and talk to people about how cool those things are. And I wanted that spaceship that he had on Cosmos, the spaceship of the imagination. That thing was awesome, right? Because you could go anywhere with it. Space, time, whatever. It was fantastic stuff. So I was like, yeah, that's what I want to be, right? I want to be that guy who knows these things. And this also fit very well with my other childhood ambition, which was, of course, to grow up to be a Jedi Knight. As many people of my generation wanted to grow up to become Jedi Knights. Some of us, well, I'll talk about the Star Wars paper later. But my point is, why did I think these two sort of fit together? Because my understanding at the time of what it would mean to be a Jedi Knight in our world would be the sort of person who could go out and defeat in single intellectual combat all manner of people that you were opposed to. So knowing lots of things and being able to defeat people in argument, that was like the perfect combination. So what career would be really good for that? Law? Tried that for a little bit, did a really bad summer internship, and I was like, no, actually, I don't really think that's what I want to do. I kind of like this whole professor thing. That works really well, being around academics in undergrad sort of convinced me that, no, that was kind of the place that I wanted to stay. Now, in retrospect, I'll tell you, a lot of my desire to be a know-it-all Jedi Knight, I understand, was coming from a very particular kind of place of fear. A place of, I need to be the smartest person in the room, and I need to prove to all of you that I'm the smartest person in the room by knocking you down left, right, center. Made for a real fun time growing up. But that was what I would do, right? And usually I was able to win most of those combats. So later on, it occurs that it's really coming much more out of kind of a fear-based place. But at the time, I don't think I recognized that. Right? It was, all right, this is just who I am, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to sally forth, and I'm going to be the person who knows things and disarms all of the various opponents and so on. Then, grad school. Now, grad school, for people who have not been. PhD comics, man, PhD comics. Everybody in grad school, everybody's ever been to grad school, looks at anything PhD comics does and is like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, we've been there. We've totally been there. The thing that one doesn't understand often about graduate school, if you are not in it, is you may go into graduate school having done really well in undergrad thinking, grad school, this is going to be like more undergrad. It's going to be like more intense undergrad on steroids. Yeah, that's what it's going to be like. No, it's not. The reason why it's not is because, and this is something that I never really realized until I was in the middle of it, graduate school, especially PhD training, is not just let's sit around and think great thoughts. It is just as much professional training as any other graduate program, and you are being professionally socialized to be able to work in a certain field of employment. And that field of employment is academia, right? That's what you're supposed to be sort of learning how to do. It's a professional training degree. It is a crash course in how to be an academic. So, right, PhD training is actually not any different than anything else in that sense. There are rules to the game of how to be a PhD student and how to be a successful academic. And the game is about scoring points against opponents, and if you score enough points against opponents, you get published or you get tenure or something along those lines, right? So it is a very interesting kind of narrow combative system that it socializes you into. Now grad school socializes you, it forms you, it makes you into a certain kind of subject, it makes you care about things, made me care about things that I didn't necessarily care about. I didn't realize until later that I'd been made to care about them until I got several years out of grad school, which is where the story is going to go, and realized that I was actually spending an awful lot of time worrying about stuff that I didn't really care about. But it's happened sort of subtly, right? The whole environment changes around you. You get incentivized to do things. For instance, probably the best example of this is publication for an academic. Publication for an academic means getting things into really low circulation, highly specialized journals that are really prestigious among very, very small sub-communities, but nobody else has ever heard of before. And nobody else reads. And it's a very weird game, right? All the academics in the room going, yeah, we know exactly how this works. Or the would-be academic, yeah, this is what you're socialized to think. Like in my field, in political science, international studies, we were handed a hierarchy of particular journals. And it was like, the world will go wonderfully for you if you get an article into International Organization. And if you get an article into one of these second-ranked journals, then that's good. And then there's these other ones that we really don't care so much about, and so on. So different academic fields have their own sort of journal hierarchy. And it's not just about the journals, it's also about the people who control those journals and the intellectual networks that surround access to those things and who you're supposed to interact with at conferences and what sorts of questions you're supposed to ask and how you position yourself and all of these really bizarre, like interpersonal politics things. And in order to succeed in academia, the lesson that I was given over and over again in graduate school was these are the rules. This is how you have to play the game. These are the kinds of things that you must do. You've got to figure out, even when shaping your own research, right? What's hot at the moment? What kinds of things are actually being read? What sorts of things are passé and no one does that anymore? So you end up shaping you'd think something that was just really just a personal expression, right, of your own research interest turn out to be something that's really heavily sociologically formed and influenced in ways that you may not even have been sort of conscious of. And we haven't even gotten into probably the worst set of single combat within modern academia, which is called peer review, which is what happens when you send an article off to a journal and other people attempt to shred your article anonymously because they have the protection of not identifying themselves, so they can say all kinds of nasty stuff, right? So this is a really disheartening process in lots of ways. So you'll notice what I haven't said a word about so far, right? I go to graduate school. The intention is to become an academic. What's missing? That's right, teaching. There's usually no word whatsoever about teaching, and if it is, it's a disparaging word, something along the lines of don't spend so much time on that because you have to reserve your time for what's really important, which is your publication strategy and getting grants and all of that sort of stuff, right? So there's sort of a move away from thinking about teaching, which is really weird because what you get hired to do is you get hired into these positions at universities where you're confronted with all these students all the time. But nobody sets you up for this. Nobody teaches you how to do that. So all the messages that you receive in graduate school are not about that. It's all, the incentive structures are about my latest book or my latest article and so on and so forth. And so when you do eventually get into the classroom, right? The kind of classroom presence that you know how to have is what you might call the baseball pitcher notion, where your job is to take the argument that you have and control it as much as possible and try to strike out all the objections. Right? So I'm going to deliver a lecture where I'm going to anticipate all the things people are going to say against my points, and I'm going to defeat them all. Right? It's exactly the same thing as you do when you write an article and try to strike out the reviewers. Right? You get 3 strikes in your reviewers and you get published. Right? Yeah. So it's the same basic set of ideas. So a pitcher, particularly a pitcher like my man Mike Mussina over here, who was also incredibly good as a good defensive pitcher, a good person at fielding his position. This is the kind of person that you get formed to be in these sorts of academic settings. And so, of course, you walk into a classroom and you start doing that because that's what you know how to do. Now, that is problematic. And that is problematic in the extreme because what it leads to is it leads to classrooms that look like that, right? It leads to big multimedia presentation of thing, and I'm going to stand up here and pontificate about how awesome I am and so on and so forth. And that becomes the kind of pedagogical model that unless one thinks about really hard, that you end up doing by default, having gone through this academic socialization, right? Carl Sagan behind a lectern, the sage on the stage. That's the kind of thing that you are, by omission, socialized into being in the classroom because no one ever has presented any sort of alternatives. And the only thing people say about teaching, as I said, is don't spend so much time on it, don't waste your time. So I had that model in my head when I TA'd my first classes in graduate school. And when I taught my first class, which was actually a U.S. foreign policy class, and I've never taught a U.S. foreign policy class ever again after having taught it this once as a graduate student, what did I do? I prepared really detailed notes. I came in. I read them to the class. I defeated all of their various objections, and I impressed everybody with my brilliance. Of course they were impressed. It was in their interest to be impressed, right? Because I was grading them. So what we had, right, what we had in that sort of a lecture situation, we had kind of a closed circuit. Imagine a sort of professor at the top and a bunch of students out here. And what happens? Well, I stand up here and I pontificate. Information is now beamed into all of your heads, and then you spit it back to me in the exam. We call it a very mutually beneficial transaction. I get a salary, you get a credit, we're good. We all kind of go our separate ways. And then this is just sort of the model that then is held in place. Now, I was never super satisfied with this particular model, even as a graduate student. In part because I'd never found this to be a useful style for me as a learner. I was the obnoxious kid here who interrupted the lecture. It was like, what about the following 14 points that refute what you just said? So I'd be the person who was not going to accept defeat in those sort of situations. Or if I didn't want to do direct combat, then you just go and complain about it to your friends afterwards, and you reteach the class on the way out. Oh my God, he should have done this, and he should have that kind of thing. So yes, I was in fact that kid. In part, I was never happy with this model because I found it kind of unfair. Weber in Sciences of Vocation has a really interesting account of this when he's talking about what happens in a lecture hall versus what happens outside of a lecture hall. And I felt in some ways what Weber's getting at here is that it's fairer to do those kinds of things where you're trying to put your opinion over on somebody outside of a lecture hall because of the power inequity in the lecture hall, right? If you speak about democracy at a public meeting, Weber said, there's no need to make a secret of your personal point of view. On the contrary, you have to take one side or the other. Explicitly, that's your duty. The words you use are not the tools of academic analysis, but they're a way of winning others over to your political point of view. They are not plowshares to loosen the solid soil of contemplative thought, but swords to be used against your opponents, weapons, in short. In the lecture room, he goes on to say, it would be an outrage to make use of language in this way. Right? The genuine teacher will take good care not to use his position at the lectern to promote any particular point of view, whether explicitly or by suggestion, for this latter tactic is, of course, the most treacherous approach, when it is done in the guise of, quote, allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Because, of course, a skilled lecturer can allow the facts to speak for themselves and lead you right along to whatever position it is that they would actually like you to occupy. And I always kind of felt that was a little bit unfair. And so that I was sort of not happy with the model that way. But also, another reason why I was kind of concerned about this particular model is because when I came here, right, when I got a job here at a place where we don't have a lot of large lecture halls, in a place where classes were generally a little bit smaller and students were like literally physically closer to you than they were in big lecture halls at NYU or something. The more and more I found what I actually wanted to do is I wanted to have conversations with students and say, here's a neat thing that I saw, and I want to have a conversation with you about this neat thing. So here's this text, or here's this theoretical problem, or here's this political issue, and let's actually just kind of talk about this. You can't talk in that model, right? I can broadcast. We can't actually have a conversation about these things. So while I was in graduate school, I actually taught in a program at Columbia, which is called the Contemporary Civilization Program. It is the original Plato to NATO class, the Western Civ course. So you literally start off with Plato and the pre-Socratics, and then you just kind of move right on up. And it was great because you were, well, a graduate student in contemporary civilization got to be what they call a preceptor, which I think is from the Latin for not paid as much as a full faculty member. And then you would have your own section, and you got a control of about a third of the syllabus. 2/3 of the syllabus was common, and then you could kind of innovate around the edges. So, I would look at it and say, okay, we need more Hobbes, so we'll do more Hobbes. Always need more Hobbes. In the spring semester when you got into the more moderns, I was like, you know what, we're not just going to read Nietzsche, we're going to read some Kierkegaard. Yeah, let's do that. So you got a chance to kind of to modify the syllabus in that way. And it was all seminar style, small classes. I was like, oh, there's something different going on here than that model. That's kind of cool. I wonder what that would be like. And I got my job here. And I was, at that point, I think you could say, kind of pulled in these two different directions. There's this particular kind of teaching that I find really engaging. And then there's all these things that I've been socialized to believe are important in graduate school. And then, this is where the sort of magical part of the story happens. And then I kept running into walls with the professional academic part. My articles were not published in top journals. I still have yet to have a single authored journal in a single authored article in a top ranked journal in my field. I probably never will. I took a heck of a time trying to get my dissertation turned into a book. I had like 14 publishers turn me down. I had a variety of obstacles in attempting to play by these rules that I had internalized from the graduate school academic game, right? I also never had a patron. Very important in graduate school sometimes, PhD programs, to have somebody who's connected to resources who can link you up and connect you into things. My dissertation chair wasn't even an international relations guy. He was a historian who did some American politics. He didn't have any idea how to connect me up with major resources. So I never had the prestigious postdoc. I've never earned a grant in my life that allowed me to buy myself out and do lots of research, right? That's never actually happened. So all the doors sort of didn't work. So you've got all these professional incentives saying, this is what you're supposed to do. And I'm like, that's not working. What is working? Oh, this teaching thing. This is cool. All right, maybe I should pay more attention to that. And I discovered that I really, 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 really like being in class with students. But this model never felt good, so I stopped doing it. I gave my last actual lecture in a classroom in 2002. And in the first instance, I just started podcasting stuff. So you would sort of use technology to get the lecture part actually out of the classroom, and then you would have more interactive discussions with people. But then what I started doing even more than that was not even podcasting lectures, but just like doing some reading notes for people, and then we would just sit around and talk about the text. So the style that I sort of started doing at Columbia then became much more pronounced in terms of the way that I teach things. I'd have colleagues come and visit my classes, and they would say, nothing's going on. You're not teaching. You're just sitting there while people talk. And I'm like, yeah, and that's really hard. And we're allowing things to emerge from an interactive conversation about issues and the use of the text. So these days, a classroom of mine is more likely to kind of look like that, right? So, because this actually was a couple weeks ago. It's a PhD seminar. You were there, Cameron. So I have the author of the book here, the White World Order, Black Power Politics book. That's Bob Vitalis is up there. Sort of we're Skyping him in there. Ann Tickner, who I'm co-teaching the class with, is out in California, and she's being Skyped in that way. Doctor Who, because of course. And then, so the class is sort of around. But the idea of sort of bringing people into contact with different kinds of texts and different kinds of perspectives, that really became more what I thought we should be doing in the classroom. I then, by chance, happened upon the work of someone who became incredibly important to my way of thinking about pedagogy, who's Parker Palmer. And Parker Palmer is a great sort of theorist of education and democracy. Wrote this wonderful book called To Know As We Are Known. And I remember reading this actually, 10 years ago now, maybe. It was a while ago. But he described a classroom. He described a hospitable classroom. And the way he described it was like this. The classroom where truth is central will be a place where every stranger and every strange utterance is met with welcome. This may suggest a classroom lacking essential rigor, a place in which questions of true and false, right and wrong are subordinated to making sure that everyone has a nice day. But that would be a false understanding of hospitality. Hospitality is not an end in itself. It is offered for the sake of what it can allow, permit, encourage, and yield. A learning space needs to be hospitable not to make learning painless, but to make the painful things possible. Things without which no learning can occur. Things like exposing ignorance, testing tentative hypotheses, challenging false or partial information, and mutual criticism of thought. Each of these is essential to obedience to truth, but none of them can happen in an atmosphere where people feel threatened and judged. And so I read that, and Palmer was like, that's exactly the kind of class that I want. That's the kind of classroom that I want. And the biggest then shift for me was sort of to go as far down that road as possible, was to really give up the idea that a classroom was supposed to be about covering the material. And that it wasn't about covering material at all, but was instead about sort of working on particular kinds of issues and having civil, complex conversations about things. I finally then, after I'd been here for a couple of years, proposed and managed to push through the university bureaucracy, the class that in some weird sense I think I'd probably always been wanting to teach since I was about 12, which was the science fiction class. Entire class on science fiction and world politics, in which we would be reading science fiction novels and watching films and talking about issues of identity and politics and theory and how they would sort of come out through those things. So, there's a couple Star Trek weeks, but then there's other stuff, right? So I wanted to marry Doria Russell's The Sparrow and Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead, and these were the kind of things I thought, we want to talk about this. When I first proposed it, a number of my colleagues, a number of people here in SIS, a number of people outside of SIS at higher level offices in the university that start with a P and end with Ovost, decided that it was a bad idea for a junior faculty member in School of International Service to be teaching a class with the title that I originally proposed for it, which was the title Social Science Fiction. So they said, no, you can't teach it. And the then director of the honors program here said, yeah, we can work on this. And so I did. So I worked on it really hard. I changed the title and left the rest of the syllabus intact. And I called it Envisioning the Future of World Politics, and somehow that got through. And so I got to teach that class. And the first day, I walked in the room and said, this class is called Envisioning the Future of World Politics because that's what the administration made me call it. Its actual title is Social Science Fiction, and now let's talk about this. And then after I got I offered it a couple times before I got tenure. After I got tenure, then I offered it under its real name because, then you're allowed, right? Then you can just say, psh, then we're just gonna teach it this way. And the greatest thing about that class is that there's no possibility of ever being confused that you're somehow covering the material. Because no, we're reading Heinlein. I mean, it's not like there's material here. What are we doing? We are engaging in discussions about the ways in which fundamental questions about law and order and identity are being conceptualized, and what does it mean to be human? I mean, you read Dune and you start thinking about the sort of political economy of intergalactic travel, and then you say, okay, well, what does that actually mean in terms of thinking about the interplay between cultural and economic factors and how we analyze complex societies and so on. So it has all these great spin-offs, but you're never, ever stuck in the idea of like, there are 3 take-home points from the reading that will be on the exam. Because there won't be an exam, and there aren't 3 take-home points. So it really breaks and frees you from having to do that. Right? So then what I ended up with is more of a way of thinking about teaching in which we move from facts, sort of the knowing that, head knowing, more toward thinking about it in terms of skills, things you do, right? Things you do in the classroom, things you do reading, arguing, making of arguments and things. But even more than that, kind of the judgment aspect. retrospect, right? How do we actually teach in a way that encourages people to work on judgment, the sort of thing that John Schotter, another theorist I'm hugely fond of, once called knowing from within, the kind of knowing how to go on in a given kind of cultural context, right? So that, how do you work on that? Well, you work on that kind of thing by giving people hypotheticals and having them talk it out. And that's what you can do through a lot of the kinds of classes that I then teach. To use a pair of old words, right? If it's sort of head knowing and hand knowing, then we could talk about the knowing from within as being about spirit or character or something, right? We don't have good scientized words for that, but we have good older words for that from older kinds of traditions. And most of my teaching is then over there. That's what I do for the most part. A little bit of this, mostly that, very few this. Not that I don't have a head full of facts. Not that I still can't defeat most people in single combat when it comes to particular areas that I know an awful lot about. You know, things like Star Wars. One of my students got me that once. The action figure where you actually can have a picture and they can make the head so it becomes you. It's great. So, you know, I get to be Obi-Wan, which was just awesome. You know, I'm very grateful in retrospect that I did not have the kind of early professional success that other people in my cohort did. Because I think there's a very plausible counterfactual universe in which, because I got rewarded for doing those things early, I kept doing that, kept specializing in that, spent as little time as possible on my teaching, did an awful lot of entertaining lectures where nobody learned anything, and just kept moving. I think that there's a plausible alternate universe in which that happened. It didn't, and it didn't happen because I kept running into these walls. Part of the great historical irony here, though, is that after I stopped caring about that sort of stuff, then I actually refound my writing voice, and I actually was able to write things that some people found compelling, and no, they don't get published in the top journals, but they get published. You know, and the last book I wrote has been widely adopted for a number of different kinds of PhD programs. I couldn't have written that book 10 years ago because I didn't have my own voice. I was trying to write in this voice that I had been socialized into. So letting go of that stuff, not being able to do that, spending time thinking about teaching, spending time on teaching, you know, in retrospect, I look on that whole thing as a great gift. At the time, it was just painful nonsense that required a lot of screaming. But, you know, in retrospect, I'm like, no, actually, that was a good thing. That was a good thing that I was able to sort of be brought to a position where I would agree with something like, and I'll close with this, this lovely, lovely sentiment that one finds in Heidegger's What is Called Thinking. Teaching is more difficult than learning. Why? Teaching is more difficult than learning because what teaching calls for is this: to let learn. The real teacher, in fact, lets nothing else be learned than learning. His conduct, therefore, often produces the impression that we properly learn nothing from him, if by learning we now suddenly understand merely the procurement of useful information. The teacher is ahead of his apprentices in this alone, that he still has far more to learn than they. He has to learn to let them learn. The teacher must be capable of being more teachable than the apprentices. The teacher is far less assured of his ground than those who learn are of theirs. If the relation between the teacher and the taught is genuine, therefore, there is never a place in it for the authority of the know-it-all or the authoritative sway of the official. It is still an exalted matter, then, to become a teacher, which is something else entirely than becoming a famous professor.